Between 1880 and 1924, roughly 2.5 million Jews fled Eastern Europe for the United States, nearly all of them passing through a single immigration station in New York Harbor. That 44-year window is now the ancestral starting point for millions of American Jewish families, their entire presence in this country traced to a handful of crossings and a door that was about to slam shut. In 1924, new quota laws were designed to make sure almost no one else from Eastern Europe could follow. The communities, the culture, the family histories that define American Jewish life today all flow from those who made it through in time. Their story begins inside the borders of the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement, established by imperial decree in 1791, stretched across a vast swath of territory on the western edge of the Russian Empire. Its borders traced a jagged arc through lands that today belong to Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. In the eyes of the Tsarist government, these lines were not just marks on a map, but strict boundaries, defining where most Jews were legally allowed to live. Within the Pale, a dense network of towns and villages, known as shtetls, became home to one of the world's largest Jewish populations. Here, Jewish life continued with remarkable diversity and resilience. From the bustling markets of Warsaw and Odessa to the quiet lanes of Berdichev or Vilna, communities built synagogues, founded schools, and ran small businesses. Some towns pulsed with the energy of commerce and learning, others remained rural, shaped by the rhythms of the land and the seasons. But the freedom to move or settle was sharply limited. Jews needed special permits to live outside the Pale, and even within its borders, many cities and rural areas were off limits. Laws changed from decade to decade, sometimes allowing a handful of merchants, university graduates, or army veterans to cross the invisible lines, but most families spent generations rooted in the same provinces. The result was a patchwork of opportunity and restriction, a world where Jewish culture flourished in close quarters, yet always under the pressure of imperial control. Despite these constraints, Jewish communities developed their own forms of self-government, religious life, and economic adaptation. There were Hasidim and Mitnagdim, Maskilim and traditionalists, each with their own customs and debates. Yiddish was the language of daily life, but Hebrew prayer and Russian bureaucracy shaped the sounds of the street and the schoolroom. The Pale became both a shelter and a cage, a place where families built lasting traditions, even as the outside world pressed in. For millions of descendants tracing their roots, the story begins in these towns, on these streets, inside the shifting borders of the Pale. Daily life inside the Pale of Settlement was shaped by a web of restrictions that touched nearly every aspect of existence. In many towns and cities, Jewish families faced municipal rules that dictated which neighborhoods they could inhabit, or even barred them from living there at all. The right to settle in a major city like Kiev or Odessa was often reserved for a privileged few: successful merchants, university graduates, or those with special permits. For most, the only option was to remain in the smaller towns and villages where their families had lived for generations. Work, too, was tightly controlled. Imperial laws excluded Jews from owning land in most provinces, shutting them out of agriculture beyond the smallest plots. Certain trades, such as distilling liquor, running inns, or working as pharmacists, were periodically forbidden or taxed at punishing rates. Government service and many skilled professions remained almost entirely closed. As a result, families relied on a narrow band of livelihoods: small-scale trade, tailoring, shoemaking, peddling, and, for the more fortunate, roles in banking or export. Some managed to build considerable businesses, while others struggled to survive from week to week. Education offered little escape. Quotas on Jewish students, a system known as numerus clausus, capped the number who could attend high schools and universities, especially in the largest cities. Even those who excelled academically found their paths blocked, with only a handful able to secure the diplomas needed for upward mobility or permission to live beyond the Pale. For most, the dream of higher education ended early, replaced by the realities of work and family responsibility. Legal vulnerability hovered over all of this. A change in policy or the whim of a local official could upend a family's security overnight. The constant threat of expulsion, fines, or new restrictions compounded the uncertainty already created by economic limits. Yet within this tightly regulated world, Jewish communities displayed remarkable variation. Some families enjoyed relative comfort, others faced grinding poverty. Religious outlooks ranged from Hasidic fervor to secular modernity, and the rhythms of life shifted from bustling market towns to quiet rural shtetls. What united them was the sense of living within boundaries, visible and invisible, that shaped every possibility for the next generation. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881 struck like a thunderclap across the Pale of Settlement. Within weeks, rumors and blame fixed on Jewish communities, and organized waves of violence erupted in cities and towns from Odessa to Kiev. These pogroms, planned attacks that involved looting, burning, and in some cases murder, shattered homes and livelihoods. Shops were ransacked, windows smashed, and families driven from their beds by mobs who faced little interference from local authorities. For many, the losses were not only material but psychological. The sense of security that had survived decades of restriction now vanished overnight. Pogroms did not end with 1881. Over the next decades, outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence recurred, sometimes sparked by political upheaval, sometimes by rumors or economic tension. Each episode left behind damaged homes, broken businesses, and families forced to start over with less than they had before. The threat was constant, sometimes just below the surface, sometimes boiling over into open violence. The state's response ranged from indifference to complicity, and the law offered little protection. For families living in the Pale, the motives for leaving began to overlap and multiply. Safety was one, but so was the grinding poverty that made survival uncertain even in years without violence. Young men faced the prospect of conscription into the Russian army, a fate that could mean years of forced service far from home. Educational quotas blocked many from pursuing higher learning or skilled professions. Some families sent a single son ahead, others pooled resources to send the youngest or the most ambitious. Letters from relatives who had already made the journey to America described new possibilities, and sometimes sent money to help pay for passage. One early departure is documented in the records of Mendel Rosenbaum, a tailor from a shtetl near Kiev. His name appears on an 1883 Hamburg departure list, then again on a New York arrival manifest, and later in naturalization papers on the Lower East Side. His journey was not unique, but it was part of a pattern repeated by thousands. A family forced to weigh risk against hope, and to cross a financial threshold before they could even consider boarding a ship. The decision to leave was rarely simple, and never made for just one reason. The journey to America rarely began at the dock. For most families in the Pale of Settlement, it started with a reckoning at the kitchen table. Passage across the Atlantic required money few possessed, and so the calculations began: a cow sold to a neighbor, a sewing machine pawned, a patch of land divided among relatives. In household ledgers and letters, the evidence lingers: livestock, tools, and even the family samovar could be converted into a ticket for one, sometimes two, rarely an entire household. The overland trek from a village in Podolia or a city like Vilna to the ports of Hamburg, Bremen, Rotterdam, or Antwerp was itself a test of resolve. Some travelers rode crowded trains, others squeezed into wagons or trudged by foot, carrying what they could not bear to leave behind. The items that survived the culling, candlesticks for Sabbath, a battered coat, a feather bed, a sewing kit, became both luggage and memory, practical tools and tokens of a world left behind. These objects appear again and again in family papers and museum collections, each one a thread tying descendants to the lives once lived in the Pale. At the European ports, departure manifests recorded names, ages, occupations, and towns of origin. In the Hamburg State Archives, a tailor from Berdichev is listed with a single trunk and a destination, New York. Some records name a relative waiting at a boarding house on Hester Street or list an employer in Newark. making the vast unknown of America just a bit more concrete. These details are not universal, but where they exist, they anchor the story in the particulars of real families. The final moments before departure were marked by more than logistics. To leave was to break from the fabric of a community, neighbors, friends, the familiar cadence of Yiddish in the market square. The walk to the train station or the port was often a procession of silent goodbyes, the weight of separation carried in every step. Only when the ship's whistle sounded did the journey to America truly begin, and with it, a new chapter for generations yet to come. Steerage meant the lowest cost ticket across the Atlantic, and for most Jewish immigrants, it was the only option they could afford. The price of passage, sometimes just a handful of dollars, was paid with savings scraped together from selling a cow, a feather bed, or a family heirloom. In return, travelers received a space in the ship's deepest hold, far below the decks where first and second class passengers dined in comfort. The steerage compartment was a world apart. Wooden bunks were stacked 2 or 3 high, each berth crowded with bodies and blankets, sometimes shared between strangers. Privacy vanished the moment the ship left port. Day and night, passengers jostled for space in narrow passageways, with only a thin curtain or a coat hung from a nail to mark the difference between one family's sleeping area and the next. The air grew thick with the smells of sweat, damp wool, and the sea. Ventilation was poor, and when the hatches were closed against storms, the space below deck became stifling. Fresh air and sunlight were rare commodities, reserved for brief moments on the open deck when weather allowed. Sanitation in steerage was basic at best. Toilets, often just buckets or rough communal facilities, served hundreds, sometimes more, and water for washing was limited. The risk of illness traveled with every passenger. Measles, typhus, and dysentery could sweep through the hold in a matter of days. In a single year, at the end of the 19th century, thousands of deaths were recorded on Atlantic crossings, most from diseases that thrived in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Yet conditions varied from ship to ship. Some crossings passed without major trouble. Others were marked by outbreaks that left families grieving before they reached the shore. Meals were simple and served in large communal spaces: bread, soup, potatoes, sometimes herring or tea. For many, the food was unfamiliar or insufficient, and families supplemented it with what provisions they had carried from home. Children played in the narrow aisles. Older passengers sat quietly with prayer books or letters from relatives already in America. Stories circulated from bunk to bunk, hopes for a new life, rumors about what awaited in New York, and memories of the towns left behind. The Atlantic voyage typically lasted 5 to 7 days, but the sense of time stretched and contracted with the weather and the mood below deck. Some ships made the crossing in less than a week. Others, delayed by storms or mechanical trouble, took longer. Every passenger lived with uncertainty. What would happen after the ship docked? Would families be allowed to stay together? Would they pass inspection or be sent back? The only certainty was that the world they knew was already behind them, and the future, whatever it held, waited just beyond the horizon. As the ship approached the American coast, the anxiety of the crossing mingled with anticipation. For many, the first sight of land was a moment of silent prayer or whispered thanks, but no one could yet claim arrival. The next ordeal, medical and legal inspection, still lay ahead. For now, the journey paused at the edge of a new continent, between the cramped darkness of steerage and the unknown promise of America. Ellis Island began its work as the nation's main federal immigration station in 1892, rising from a small island in New York Harbor to become the first American landmark for millions of newcomers. For families arriving from Eastern Europe, this was the final hurdle after weeks of uncertainty and hardship. The process that awaited them was brisk, systematic, and, despite the anxiety it provoked, remarkably efficient for its time. Upon disembarking, passengers joined a long line that wound its way through the cavernous registry room. The first step was a rapid medical inspection. United States Public Health Service physicians stood along the line, watching as each person climbed a short flight of stairs. They looked for signs of physical or mental illness: a limp, a persistent cough, an eye infection. The exam was quick, often lasting only seconds. If a doctor spotted something concerning, he marked the immigrant's clothing with a piece of chalk. Each letter had a meaning: E for eye trouble, H for heart, L for lameness, X for suspected mental disability. About 1 in 5 received a mark and were diverted to a separate area for a more thorough medical exam. For most, the inspection ended there. Those who passed the medical screen moved on to the next stage, the legal interview. Immigration inspectors, not doctors, made the final decision about who could enter. The questions were practical and direct. Where are you going? Who is meeting you? What work will you do? Can you support yourself? The answers were checked against the ship's manifest, a document prepared before departure in Europe. Inspectors wanted to be sure that new arrivals had a plan and would not become a public burden. They also looked for signs of criminal history or political radicalism, but the main focus was on health, self-sufficiency, and family connections. The vast majority, about 98%, were approved and allowed to continue their journey within a matter of hours. For them, Ellis Island was a brief pause, not an ordeal. Their names, occupations, and destinations were recorded, and they stepped out onto the ferry that would carry them to Manhattan, Brooklyn, or beyond. For a small minority, the story was different. Those flagged for further medical inspection might wait days or even weeks for a final decision. A diagnosis of contagious disease or a finding of likely to become a public charge could mean exclusion and a return voyage at the shipping company's expense. Yet these cases were the exception, not the rule. The process reflected a balance between the country's desire to welcome newcomers and its impulse to protect public health and social order. Chalk marks and rapid-fire questions were not just bureaucratic routines, they were the gatekeepers of a new life. For descendants tracing their roots, the records of Ellis Island capture both the anxiety and the hope that defined this moment. Most families passed through in a single afternoon, carrying little more than a bundle of possessions and a memory of the questions that decided their future. The efficiency and scale of this system, processing thousands each day, admitting nearly all, helped shape the fabric of American Jewish life for generations to come. The question of names has become a touchstone for anyone tracing family roots to Ellis Island. Yet the story is less about dramatic transformations in an inspector's ledger and more about the quiet march of paperwork across borders. Before any ship left Hamburg, Bremen, or Antwerp, company agents prepared detailed manifests. These lists, compiled days before arrival in New York, recorded each passenger's name, age, occupation, and intended destination. The names were written down as the traveler pronounced them, sometimes in Yiddish, sometimes in Russian, Polish, or German, filtered through the ear and pen of a European clerk. When arrivals reached Ellis Island, the process was not a blank slate encounter. Clerks at the immigration station did not invent new names. Instead, they matched each person to the manifest already in hand. If a surname was unfamiliar or hard to spell, the clerk might write it phonetically, guided by the sound of the traveler's answer. This was not an official name change, but a moment of transliteration, one layer of spelling shaped by dialect and the clerk's own language skills. A man whose surname was Katz in Cyrillic might become Katz, or even Katz in the manifest, depending on the clerk and the port of departure. Many changes happened long before Ellis Island. In the towns and ports of Europe, names were sometimes altered to fit local records or to comply with government requirements. A family might appear as Rabinovich in Russian records, Rabinowitz in German, or Rabinovich in French. Official U.S. name changes were a separate step, made voluntarily years later, at a courthouse, in a naturalization petition, or on a marriage certificate, often to make a name easier to spell, pronounce, or fit in with American neighbors. The paper trail is layered. The ship's manifest, the inspection card carried through Ellis Island, and later naturalization records each preserved a version of the name. Spelling shifts were common, but the core identity remained. For descendants searching today, these records, now digitized and searchable, reveal not just a name, but the journey of a family through languages, alphabets, and continents. Each document a fragment of a much larger story. The 1880s marked the beginning of a new era for Eastern European Jews seeking a life beyond the boundaries of the Pale of Settlement. After the shock of the 1881 pogroms, the first organized departures began to take shape. These were not the mass exoduses of later decades, but the earliest signs of a community in motion, young families and skilled artisans, often the ones with just enough resources or connections to attempt the journey. In town records and shipping manifests, their names appear alongside occupations like tailor, cobbler, and small trader, hinting at the practical skills they hoped would open doors in a distant country. This initial wave was modest by later standards, but still substantial. The Library of Congress estimates that more than 200,000 Eastern European Jews arrived in the United States during the 1880s alone. Each family's decision was shaped by a mix of urgency and calculation, the fear of renewed violence, the squeeze of new May laws, and the hope that America's open ports could become a refuge. Letters home described the challenges and opportunities of the Lower East Side, and sometimes included a few dollars to help a brother or cousin make the crossing. Those who left in the 1880s often traveled ahead of the largest crowds, forging the first links in what would become a chain migration. They set patterns for others to follow, sending word back to their towns, pooling money for tickets, and finding work in the garment trades or small shops. Some managed to bring over their wives and children within a year or two. Others waited longer, building a foothold before risking another passage. By the end of the decade, the outlines of a new American Jewish community had begun to take shape, still small but growing, ready to receive the much larger movement that would soon follow. Between 1900 and 1914, the flow of Jewish families from Eastern Europe to America swelled into its largest wave. In these years alone, more than 1 million people left the towns and villages of the Pale of Settlement, following routes that had grown familiar. Letters from relatives already in New York or Philadelphia described jobs in the garment factories, crowded but safe apartments, and a life where children could go to school. These messages, often folded with a few hard-earned dollars, helped turn the dream of migration into a plan. By the new century, the process had become more organized. No longer did each family face the journey alone. Established destinations in America, especially the Lower East Side, offered not just a place to land, but a network of kin and neighbors ready to help. Shipping agents in Warsaw, Minsk, and Odessa worked hand in hand with relatives abroad, arranging tickets and coordinating arrivals. Some families sent a father or eldest son ahead, trusting that steady work would allow the rest to follow. Others traveled together, their names appearing in order on the ship's manifest. One story, preserved in the oral history of Goldie Supsky-Roth and supported by passenger lists, shows how these departures often unfolded in steps. Goldie's father, Levi, left Poland in 1914, finding work and a foothold in New York before sending for his wife and daughter. Their reunion, delayed by the war, was both a family triumph and a pattern repeated in thousands of households. The journey was rarely simple, but the chain of support, from cousins, uncles, and landsmen, made it possible for so many to cross an ocean and begin again. Then, in the summer of 1914, the outbreak of World War I brought the movement to an abrupt halt. Steamship lines were commandeered for military use, borders closed, and the familiar flow of tickets and remittances dried up almost overnight. For families still waiting in Europe, the path to America vanished, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The great wave of migration, which had seemed unstoppable, paused on the edge of a continent at war. Between 1919 and 1924, the journey from Eastern Europe to America narrowed dramatically. The chaos of the Russian Civil War and political upheaval across the former Pale of Settlement sent families searching for safety, but the doors they found in New York were no longer wide open. The United States had begun to treat immigration as a matter of arithmetic, not just refuge. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act. For the first time, the number of arrivals from each country was capped. Just 3% of the people from that nation already living in the U.S., measured by the 1910 census. For Jews from Russia and Poland, this formula meant the era of mass chain migration was over. The quotas didn't stop the flow overnight, but transformed it into a slow-moving line. Families who once expected to reunite in a matter of months now found themselves waiting for a lottery slot, hoping their number would come up before the quota closed for the year. Then in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act drew the circle even tighter. The law dropped the quota to 2%, but more importantly, it rewound the clock. Now the baseline was the 1890 census, a time before most Eastern European Jews had arrived. The effect was stark. Quotas for Russia and Poland shrank to a fraction of what they'd been, and the new rules required every immigrant to secure a U.S. visa from a consulate overseas before even booking passage. The gatekeepers now sat in Warsaw or Bucharest, not on Ellis Island. For many, this meant families were split across continents, with some members stranded by paperwork or by the simple calculation of numbers. The paper trail of the Feldman family, for example, shows a brother arriving in Galveston in 1922, just before the quotas tightened, while his sister waited years for her chance. The quota system didn't end immigration on a single day, but it turned the once steady stream into a trickle. And for most, the window had closed. The legacy of these laws is visible in family trees and in the records that stop abruptly after 1924, marking the end of an era that shaped millions of American Jewish lives. Manhattan's Lower East Side became the first American address for hundreds of thousands of Jewish newcomers. The neighborhood's narrow streets and crowded tenements offered a landing place for families who had crossed an ocean with little more than hope and a bundle of belongings. It was here, in the shadow of elevated trains and pushcarts, that a new kind of American life began to take shape, one built, above all, on work. The garment trade was the heart of this world. Many arrivals brought skills honed in the old country: tailoring, cutting, piecework, sewing by hand or with a battered machine. Workshops filled with cutters, seamstresses, pressers, and finishers sprang up in basements, back rooms, and converted apartments. Some were family affairs, with fathers, mothers, and older children all contributing. Others were small shops owned by a single entrepreneur, often someone who had arrived just a few years earlier and managed to save enough for a few machines and a handful of workers. Conditions inside these sweatshops were harsh. Workdays stretched 10, sometimes 12 hours. Air inside was thick with lint and steam, and the only light came from a single window or a bare bulb. In summer, heat pressed in from the street. In winter, the cold seeped through thin walls. Pay was low and never guaranteed. If orders slowed or a contractor disappeared, families went hungry. Yet for most, this work represented a step forward, a chance to earn in dollars, not kopecks, and to send children to school instead of the fields or the army. As the garment industry grew, so did the risks and frustrations. Fires broke out with terrifying speed, and injuries from machines were common. The 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which killed 146 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian women, remains the most infamous tragedy, but smaller accidents were daily facts of life. Out of these dangers came a new sense of urgency and collective action. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, founded in 1900, began to organize cutters and seamstresses for better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes swept through the Lower East Side, with women and men marching together, demanding dignity as well as wages. Some won contracts, others faced blacklists or eviction. Upward mobility was possible, but never guaranteed. A few families managed to open their own shops or move uptown, trading the noise of Hester Street for quieter blocks in Brooklyn or the Bronx. Many more remained in the same cramped apartments, sharing beds and meals, pooling earnings to cover rent and groceries. The promise of America was real, but so was the persistence of poverty. For every success story, there were dozens of families struggling to stay afloat, yet even the smallest gains mattered. A new coat for a child, a week's pay saved for a future move, a letter home describing steady work. These were victories measured in small increments, but they built the foundation for the generations that followed. In the Lower East Side's garment shops, the story of migration became a story of labor, of hands at work, of voices raised in protest, and of families carving out a foothold in a city that demanded everything but offered, at last, the chance to begin again. For families arriving on the Lower East Side, survival depended on more than luck or hard work. It depended on the web of support they built, one that stretched across oceans and generations. At the heart of this network stood the Landsmannschaften, mutual aid societies formed by people who came from the same town, village, or region in Eastern Europe. These were not abstract clubs, but lifelines, organized by men and women who remembered the same streets, spoke the same dialect, and carried the same hometown memories. The Landsmannschaften collected small dues from their members, pooling these funds for practical needs. When someone fell ill, the society stepped in with sick relief, paying for doctors, medicine, or a week's rent. If a member died, the Landsmannschaft guaranteed a proper funeral and a burial plot, sparing families the fear of a pauper's grave. In a world where commercial insurance was rare and city charity unpredictable, these promises were more than comfort. They were security. But the support ran deeper still. When strikes erupted in the garment shops, Landsmannschaften organized strike aid, delivering groceries or a few dollars to families whose breadwinners risked their jobs for better conditions. Social events, holiday gatherings, and evening lectures brought people together, turning strangers into neighbors and neighbors into friends. For newcomers stepping off the boat with little English and no money, the first question was often, "Is there a landsman here, someone from my town?" More often than not, there was. Relatives and fellow townspeople helped newcomers find their first job, a bed in a shared apartment, or a loan to get started. The address book of a Landsmannschaft secretary sometimes held the fate of a dozen families. In the shadow of poverty and uncertainty, these societies built a safety net from the ground up. They offered not just financial help, but a sense of belonging, a reminder that even in a foreign city, no one from the old town would be left entirely alone. Yiddish was more than a language spoken at home. On the Lower East Side, it became the voice of a public world, one built in newsprint, on theater stages, and in the crowded meeting halls above bakeries and tailor shops. Abraham Cahan, who arrived from Lithuania in 1882, captured the pulse of this new society. As the editor of the Vorwärts, or Jewish Daily Forward, Cahan shaped the way generations of immigrants saw themselves, their neighbors, and the city around them. His columns offered advice on everything from labor disputes to love troubles, blending socialist ideals with the practical needs of families trying to find their footing in America. Under his guidance, the Vorwärts grew from a 4-page sheet to the world's largest Yiddish daily, with a circulation that sometimes topped 200,000. But the Vorwärts was never alone. Der Tog, founded in 1914, carved out a reputation for intellectual debate and literary criticism, speaking to readers hungry for news and culture in their mother tongue. Together, these papers did more than report events. They became forums where garment strikes on Orchard Street were weighed against the politics of distant Russia, where the fate of American labor laws was debated alongside the future of Jewish life in Palestine. Editorials, letters, and serialized stories turned the Yiddish press into a living conversation, a place where ideas from Europe collided with the realities of New York. Beyond the newsstands, Second Avenue earned its nickname as Yiddish Broadway. Dozens of theaters lined the street, drawing crowds for comedies, melodramas, and biting satires. The stage was a mirror, reflecting the hopes, frustrations, and humor of a community in transition. Playwrights and actors like Boris Tomaszewski and Molly Picon used laughter and song to preserve the rhythms of Yiddish, even as younger generations rushed to learn English. The theater poked fun at old-world customs, questioned the promises of American life, and offered a space where immigrants could see their own struggles and triumphs brought to life. Through these institutions, Yiddish became a language of public debate and cultural continuity. It was the medium for arguments about workers' rights, women's roles, Zionism, and assimilation. It carried the voices of parents and children, radicals, and traditionalists into the next generation. Even as the sound of Yiddish faded from the streets, its imprint remained. In the stories families told, the songs remembered at celebrations, and the humor passed down through generations. For millions of descendants, these newspapers and theaters were not just relics of the past. They were the institutions that carried a people's language, arguments, and laughter into American life, shaping the identity of a community that began with a handful of ships and grew into a lasting presence on these shores. For many American Jews today, the search for family origins begins with a simple question: where did we come from? The answer, for a large majority, leads back to the Great Migration from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924. Modern surveys show that most American Jews identify as Ashkenazi, a heritage rooted in the shtetls and cities of the former Russian Empire, Poland, Lithuania, and surrounding regions. But while these surveys capture cultural identity, they rarely pinpoint exactly when or how a particular ancestor arrived. The real work of tracing a family's journey across the Atlantic starts not with a distant myth, but with a street address, often in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago. A present-day descendant might open an old city directory or census return and find a relative listed on Hester Street or Delancey. From there, a chain of records begins to form. Passenger manifests, preserved by the National Archives and digitized on sites like Family Search and Find My Past, list names, ages, occupations, and towns of origin. Naturalization files add birth dates, places, and sometimes the names of parents. Each document offers a snapshot, a clue that links one generation to the next. Census records, taken every 10 years, show how families grew and changed. They track moves from crowded tenements to quieter neighborhoods, list new children, and record changing occupations, from tailor to shopkeeper, from peddler to factory foreman. City directories fill in the gaps, placing a household at a specific address in a given year, sometimes noting a business or a trade. Burial records, too, hold vital details: Hebrew names, dates of birth and death, and, in many cases, the name of the town in Europe where a family's story began. But the path is rarely straightforward. Family names appear with multiple spellings, shaped by Yiddish pronunciation, Russian or Polish clerks, and the quirks of American record keepers. A surname like Rabinovich might become Rabinowitz, Rabinovich, or even Robin. Place names shift as well. A town listed as Dubno in one record may appear as Dubna or Dubno in another, and the country itself might be recorded as Russia, Poland, or Ukraine, depending on the year and the borders in force at the time. To resolve these puzzles, genealogists turn to tools like the Jewish Gentown Finder, which connects historical place names to modern geography. A search for a vanished shtetl can reveal its present-day location in Belarus or Ukraine, even if the borders have changed half a dozen times since an ancestor left. Databases like Jewish Gen, Family Search, and Find My Past work together, each offering different collections of manifests, censuses, and burial lists. By comparing names, dates, and addresses across these sources, a researcher can piece together the mosaic of a family's journey. The process is painstaking, but it brings the past into focus. Each record is a thread, tying today's descendants to the towns and families that formed the heart of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Through these documents, the Great Migration becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a living chain, stretching from the crowded streets of the Lower East Side back to the fields and marketplaces of the Old World, and forward into the lives of millions of Americans who carry those stories with them. DNA testing has become a powerful tool for people searching for their Jewish ancestry, but its results come with important boundaries. Most commercial tests examine autosomal DNA, which can confirm broad Ashkenazi heritage and connect distant cousins who share fragments of the same genetic legacy. These matches often reach across continents, linking families who lost touch after the migrations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet the information is general, not specific. Autosomal results can suggest that two people have roots somewhere in the former Pale of Settlement, but they cannot pinpoint a particular shtetl, identify a specific ancestor who boarded a ship, or reveal the exact date when a family crossed the Atlantic. Other tests, such as Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, trace the deep paternal or maternal line. These markers travel down a single branch of the family tree, father to son, mother to daughter, sometimes reaching back hundreds or even thousands of years. They can show whether a direct male or female ancestor came from a certain region, but even these results cannot by themselves prove a connection to a named individual or a known town. Over generations, the genetic signal becomes fainter, as each new marriage brings in new DNA and the web of relationships grows more complex. For those longing to reconstruct a complete family history, DNA alone cannot provide all the answers. The responsible approach combines genetic clues with documentary evidence, passenger lists, census returns, naturalization files, and burial records. Oral history, too, plays a vital role, preserving the names of towns and the stories of departures that may not survive in any official archive. Town histories, synagogue records, and even old letters can fill in the gaps that DNA leaves untouched. Together, these sources form a mosaic. DNA might open the door to a lost cousin or confirm a shared heritage, but it is the paper trail and the spoken memory that anchor a family to a place, a time, and a journey that shaped the lives of millions. Today, over 90% of American Jews trace their ancestry to this concentrated wave of migration. As new generations search for roots and meaning, the ties forged in crowded tenements and on crowded ships still shape identity, memory, and belonging. The story of a few ships continues to echo in millions of American lives, a reminder that every journey leaves its mark.